When a hard-working project manager pours her soul into a groundbreaking software deal, she expects recognition and a well-earned bonus. Instead, her lazy, conniving boss steals the credit, and her $50,000 bonus, leaving her humiliated and furious. But this isn't just a story of workplace betrayal. Determined to expose his lies, she uncovers a web of corruption, fraudulent expenses, stolen company funds, and a CEO who might be covering for it all. What starts as a mission for justice spirals into a high-stakes game of corporate revenge, where loyalty is tested, alliances are forged, and the stakes are higher than she ever imagined. With her boss gunning for a COO promotion and time running out, she orchestrates a daring takedown to expose the scandal. But the ending? It's more shocking, scandalous, and satisfying than anyone could have predicted. Sometimes, justice isn't just about getting even, it's about coming out on top. The office was alive with energy that day. After months of sleepless nights, constant setbacks, and endless revisions, our team had finally pulled it off. The software prototype we'd worked tirelessly on was a resounding success, and the client, the biggest name in the industry, had signed a multi-million-dollar deal. It was the kind of win that people in our field could only dream of. I should have been on top of the world. Instead, I felt a gnawing unease as I glanced at Brad during the team meeting. My boss, the self-proclaimed genius of the company, was already laying it on thick. His booming laugh echoed across the conference room as he cracked jokes and bragged about our achievement, while somehow never mentioning the people who had actually made it happen. "That's how we do it here," Brad said, flashing his perfect, unervingly white smile. "When I lead, we win." I clenched my jaw but stayed silent. Brad had been my boss for 2 years, and in that time, I had learned a lot about him, none of it good. He was the kind of man who cared more about appearances than results. He was always the loudest in the room, always quick to take credit but equally quick to dodge blame. I didn't trust him, but up until now, I thought I could navigate around his ego. The next day, an email landed in my inbox from Human Resources, the announcement of the long-awaited bonuses. My heart raced as I opened it, imagining the reward I'd earned after pouring my soul into this project. The email was brief, almost clinical. And at the very bottom, in bold letters, it read: "Bonus amount, $0. I blinked. That couldn't be right. It had to be a mistake. My hands were shaking as I stared at the screen, reading the words over and over. $0. After all the work I'd done. Panic quickly gave way to anger. I grabbed my phone and texted my friend Amanda, who was also on the project team. Did you see the bonus email? Is yours as bad as mine?" "Amanda, I got $8,000. "What's wrong?" $8,000. That's what Amanda had received, and while I thought she deserved even more, it proved that bonuses had been distributed. So why was mine empty? I stormed down the hallway to Brad's office. His door was open, as it always was, a passive-aggressive invitation that dared anyone to challenge him. He was sitting back in his chair, scrolling through his phone, looking like he didn't have a care in the world. "Brad," I said, my voice barely steady. "I need to talk to you about my bonus." He didn't even look up. "What about it?" "I didn't get one," I said. "There must be a mistake. HR said it was determined by contribution to the project, and..." Brad finally raised his head, his face a mask of feigned concern. "Oh, right. That. I repeated, my frustration mounting. Brad sighed, leaned back further in his chair, and folded his hands behind his head. "Look, the higher-ups decided your contribution wasn't as significant as others. It's not personal. Just how the numbers played out." I felt the blood drain from my face. Not significant. I had managed the entire project, coordinating with the client, leading the team, solving last-minute issues that no one else could figure out. Without me, the deal wouldn't have happened. Brad, that's not true, and you know it, I said, my voice rising. I was in charge of this project. I worked harder than anyone. His smirk was infuriating. Well, maybe you should have worked harder. I stared at him, speechless. It wasn't just the insult, it was the complete lack of remorse in his tone. He didn't care. He never cared. I walked out of his office in a daze, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. But the worst was yet to come. Later that afternoon, Amanda came by my desk, looking uneasy. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "No," I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. "I just don't understand what happened." She hesitated before saying, "I think I do. I heard something, about Brad." "What do you mean?" Amanda glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Then she leaned in closer and whispered, "Brad got a massive bonus. Like, $50,000 massive." My stomach dropped. "What?" "Yeah," she said. "I heard one of the guys in accounting talking about it. He said Brad claimed it was his leadership that closed the deal, so he got the lion's share of the bonus pool." I felt like I was going to throw up. Brad had stolen my work, and then turned around and used it to line his own pockets. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment, a glass of cheap wine in one hand and my laptop in the other, staring at the company website. I couldn't stop replaying everything in my mind, the late nights, the missed weekends, the stress that had pushed me to the brink. And for what? So Brad could waltz in and take everything I'd earned. I wanted to quit. I wanted to march into the office the next morning and scream at him in front of everyone. I wanted to humiliate him the way he had humiliated me. But then I remembered the look on his face when he told me I wasn't significant enough, the smug, self-satisfied smirk of someone who thought they were untouchable. And in that moment, my anger transformed into something sharper. Something colder. If Brad thought he could get away with this, he was wrong. I wasn't just going to expose him, I was going to ruin him. The days that followed were torture. Every time I walked into the office, I had to see Brad's smug face, hear his booming laughter, and endure his constant posturing. To him, it was business as usual, but to me, it was personal. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was determined. I knew the truth about Brad, but knowing wasn't enough. I needed proof, concrete, undeniable evidence that would expose him for what he really was. So I got to work. I started small. During late nights at the office, when the building was nearly empty, I'd search through shared files on the company drive. Most of it was routine, client contracts, team reports, standard HR policies. But the deeper I dug, the more I started to notice little irregularities. Files were misplaced, expense reports were inconsistent, and there were entire folders that seemed like they'd been hurriedly buried under layers of meaningless documentation. Then one night, I hit the jackpot. It was after 9 p.m., and the office was eerily quiet. I was in one of the smaller conference rooms, scrolling through the drive while pretending to work on a budget spreadsheet. That's when I found it, a folder labeled 2019 Expenses, Archived. At first glance, it seemed harmless. But as I opened the folder, my curiosity turned into disbelief. It was filled with expense reports Brad had submitted over the past 2 years. They looked normal at first, with standard charges for travel, client dinners, and office supplies. But the more I looked, the more I started to notice something strange. For one, the amounts were astronomical. A client dinner for $3,500 at a restaurant that didn't even exist. A business trip to Las Vegas that coincided suspiciously with his Instagram posts about a bachelor party. Receipts for electronics that were clearly personal purchases, flat-screen TVs, gaming consoles, and even a luxury coffee machine. I couldn't believe it. Brad wasn't just stealing credit for my work, he was embezzling company money. I quickly downloaded copies of everything onto a flash drive. My heart was racing, and every creak or distant noise in the office made me jump. I half expected Brad to come barging in, demanding to know what I was doing. But the building remained silent, and after nearly an hour, I had all the files I needed. The next day, I began quietly sharing my discovery with a few trusted colleagues. Amanda was the first person I approached. When I showed her the expense reports, she looked stunned. This is insane," she said, scrolling through the files on my laptop. "How has he been getting away with this?" "I don't know," I said. "But I'm going to make sure he doesn't get away with it anymore." Amanda was on board immediately. She hated Brad almost as much as I did, and once she saw the evidence, she was ready to fight. Over the next week, we brought a few more people into our circle, carefully chosen colleagues who had also been wronged by Brad. Each of them had their own story about his lies, manipulation, or outright theft, and each of them was eager to see him taken down. One of our biggest allies turned out to be Grace, the company's accountant. I wasn't sure if she'd want to get involved, but when I showed her the evidence, she let out a bitter laugh. "I knew it," she said, shaking her head. "I've had a bad feeling about Brad for months. He's always pushing for reimbursements without proper documentation. But every time I brought it up, he'd just wave me off or call in a favor from the higher-ups." With Grace's help, we started digging even deeper. She had access to records I couldn't touch, and what she uncovered was even worse than I'd imagined. Brad had been inflating project costs, submitting duplicate invoices, and fabricating entire transactions. Over the past 2 years, he had siphoned nearly $200,000 from the company. While gathering the evidence, I couldn't help but think about all the people who had suffered because of Brad's greed. The team members who'd worked overtime without proper compensation. The junior employees who'd been denied promotions because Brad claimed their ideas as his own. And, of course, me, sitting in my tiny apartment, wondering how I'd make rent, while Brad cashed a $50,000 bonus check he didn't deserve. But I didn't let my anger cloud my judgment. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about justice. We began planning our next move. Grace suggested taking the evidence straight to the CEO, but I hesitated. The CEO, Mr. Callahan, was known for being detached from the day-to-day operations of the company. He rarely interacted with employees below the executive level, and I wasn't sure if he'd believe me, or worse, if he'd choose to protect Brad to avoid a scandal. Instead, I decided to play the long game. Brad's ego was his biggest weakness, and I knew how to use it against him. He loved showing off, whether it was flaunting his new car in the parking lot or bragging about his connections at industry events. So I started feeding his arrogance. "Great job on the client presentation," I'd say after meetings, even though I knew he hadn't done any of the work. "You've got such a knack for this kind of thing." He lapped it up. Every compliment made him more careless, more confident that he was untouchable. But behind the scenes, I was building a bomb that would destroy him. One night, as I was reviewing the final pieces of evidence, Amanda called me. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her voice shaking with excitement. "I overheard Brad talking to one of his buddies on the phone. He's planning to pitch himself as the next COO." I nearly dropped my laptop. "The next COO?" I repeated. "Yeah," Amanda said. "He thinks this project win is going to make him a shoo-in for the promotion. If Brad became COO, it would be game over. He'd gain even more power, more resources, and more ways to cover his tracks. Exposing him wasn't just a priority anymore, it was a race against time." But I wasn't scared. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm. I had everything I needed to take him down, and I wasn't going to stop until I did. Brad thought he was untouchable. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The day Brad announced his plans to pitch himself for the COO position, I knew it was time to put my plan into motion. He was brazenly bragging about it in the break room, leaning against the counter with his usual smug grin, recounting his so-called vision for leadership to anyone within earshot. "Let's face it," Brad said, stirring his coffee. "This company needs someone like me at the top. Someone who can take it to the next level. The CEO already knows what I'm capable of." My fists clenched as I listened from around the corner, but I forced myself to stay calm. Let him talk. Every word he spoke only cemented the arrogance that would be his downfall. I walked into the break room and plastered a fake smile on my face. "Wow, Brad. Cool. That's a big deal." He turned to me, flashing that infuriating grin. "Biggest deal of my career," he said. "But honestly, I deserve it. Leadership isn't for everyone, you know." "Oh, I know," I said, my voice dripping with fake admiration. "It's incredible what you've accomplished. I'm sure the CEO will be blown away by your pitch." He laughed and clapped me on the shoulder. "Exactly. Glad you get it, kid." I forced myself to laugh along, even as the anger boiled under my skin. He had no idea that I'd been spending every spare moment dismantling the very foundation of his career. Over the next few days, I worked with Amanda, Grace, and the small circle of trusted allies we'd assembled. We finalized the evidence, organizing everything into a meticulously detailed report. The fake expense reports. The fraudulent invoices. The inflated project costs. Screenshots of emails and messages where Brad blatantly bragged about his schemes. But I didn't stop there. With Grace's help, I gathered data to show exactly how Brad's actions had impacted the company. We calculated how his embezzlement had drained resources, how his inflated expenses had cut into profits, and how his lies had jeopardized relationships with key clients. It wasn't just about proving he was a thief, it was about showing that he was a liability. The next step was timing. Brad had scheduled a private meeting with the CEO for his COO pitch, and we knew that would be our moment. But I wasn't going to let him get the upper hand, not even for a second. On the day of his meeting, I sent an email to the CEO's assistant. It was short and direct. Subject: urgent concern regarding leadership integrity. Hi, assistant's name. I've come across some serious evidence regarding misconduct within the company that I believe the CEO needs to see immediately. I will provide a full report in person. Please let me know if I can schedule a time to meet. I hit send and waited, my heart pounding. I didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, I received a reply. Subject: urgent concern. The CEO is available for a meeting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Please bring your report. I smiled as I read the email. Tomorrow morning would be Brad's undoing. That evening, I stayed late at the office, going over the final details of my presentation. Amanda and Grace joined me, and together we rehearsed how I would explain the evidence. "You've got this," Amanda said, giving me an encouraging smile. "Just stick to the facts. The proof speaks for itself." Grace nodded. "And don't let the CEO brush this under the rug. If he hesitates, remind him how much money Brad's theft has cost the company. No CEO wants to deal with a financial scandal." Their support gave me the confidence I needed. By the time I left the office, I was ready. But I wasn't done yet. The next morning, I arrived at the office an hour early. Brad was already there, strutting around in a new suit, practically glowing with anticipation. His meeting with the CEO was scheduled for 10 a.m., right after mine. He caught sight of me as I walked in and smirked. "Big day for the company," he said, raising his coffee mug in mock toast. I smiled back, the kind of smile that didn't reach my eyes. "It sure is, Brad." He had no idea. At exactly 9 a.m., I stepped into the CEO's office. Mr. Callahan sat behind his massive mahogany desk, flipping through papers. He was a tall, imposing man in his mid-50s with a no-nonsense demeanor. As I sat down, he looked up, his piercing blue eyes locking onto mine. "All right," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You said you had something urgent to discuss. Let's hear it." I took a deep breath and opened my laptop. "Thank you for meeting with me, Mr. Callahan. I've uncovered evidence of serious misconduct by Brad Dawson that I believe you need to see." His brow furrowed. "Go on." I began my presentation, walking him through each piece of evidence. I showed him the expense reports, the fabricated invoices, and the inflated costs. I explained how Brad had manipulated the bonus pool, stealing money that should have gone to other employees. As I spoke, Callahan's expression shifted from confusion to anger. By the time I finished, his jaw was clenched, and his hands were balled into fists on the desk. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Why hasn't this been brought to my attention before?" "Brad has a way of silencing people," I said carefully. "He's used his position to intimidate employees and cover his tracks. But the evidence is all here." I handed him a printed copy of the report, along with a USB drive containing all the files. "Everything you need is in there." Callahan stared at the report for a moment, then looked up at me. "Thank you for bringing this to me. I'll handle it from here." I nodded, but before I left, I turned back to him. "One more thing, Mr. Callahan," I said. "Brad has a meeting with you at 10 a.m. to pitch himself for the COO position. I think you'll find his claims about his leadership enlightening, given this new information." Callahan's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "Noted." I walked out of the office feeling a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The ball was in Callahan's court now, but I had no doubt he would act. A man like him didn't tolerate fraud or incompetence. At 10 a.m. sharp, Brad strutted into the CEO's office, radiating confidence. I watched from my desk as he walked past, giving me a wink as he closed the door behind him. I couldn't help but smile. The storm was about to hit. I spent the next 30 minutes pretending to work, my eyes glued to the CEO's office door. Brad had walked in like a king, and I was dying to see how he'd walk out. My mind raced with all the possible ways this could play out. Would he yell? Would he storm out? Would he beg for mercy? But when the door finally opened, it wasn't Brad who came out, it was Mr. Callahan. He strode past my desk without a word, his expression grim, and disappeared into the elevator. A few seconds later, Brad stepped out. To my shock, he didn't look angry or panicked. In fact, he was grinning. "What the hell?" Brad spotted me watching and sauntered over, his grin widening. "Rough day, huh?" he said, sipping his coffee like nothing had happened. I forced a neutral expression, though my heart was racing. "How'd your meeting go?" "Oh, fantastic," he said, leaning casually against my desk. The CEO was really impressed. "Let's just say big things are on the horizon for me." I blinked, completely thrown. This wasn't possible. I had handed Callahan irrefutable proof of Brad's fraud. There was no way he could have walked out of that meeting unscathed, unless Callahan was covering for him. That thought haunted me for the rest of the day. Every time I saw Brad, laughing and joking with his cronies, my anger grew. Had I just wasted weeks of effort? Had Callahan swept everything under the rug to avoid a scandal? But the worst came at 5 p.m., when an email hit everyone's inbox. Subject: Exciting leadership announcement. Dear team. It is my pleasure to announce that Brad Dawson has been appointed as the company's new Chief Operating Officer. Brad's leadership and vision have been instrumental to our success, and I am confident he will continue to drive the company forward in his new role. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. My hands were trembling as I reread the email, my mind racing with disbelief. How could this be happening? Amanda appeared at my desk moments later, her face pale with fury. "This has to be a joke," she said, gripping the edge of my desk. How the hell did he pull this off? I don't know, I whispered. But something's not right. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed every detail of my meeting with Callahan, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. Then, around 2 a.m., a thought struck me like lightning. What if Callahan wasn't covering for Brad? What if Callahan was in on it? The pieces began to fall into place. Callahan had always been distant, rarely engaging with employees or attending team meetings. He'd left most of the company's day-to-day operations to people like Brad, trusting them to handle things. And Brad? He'd always acted like he was untouchable, like he had some kind of shield protecting him. What if that shield was the CEO himself? The next morning, I called an emergency meeting with Amanda, Grace, and the rest of our circle. We're not done, I said, slamming my laptop onto the table. If Callahan is protecting Brad, then we need to expose both of them. Grace hesitated. You're talking about taking on the CEO. That's dangerous. I don't care, I said firmly. If we let this go, they'll get away with everything. And we're not the only ones they've hurt. Think about all the employees they've screwed over. Someone has to stop them. Amanda nodded. I'm in. What's the plan? I leaned forward, lowering my voice. We go public. Over the next week, we compiled a new report, not just on Brad, but on Callahan as well. Grace dug into company records and found several questionable transactions tied to the CEO, including suspiciously large consulting fees paid to shell companies. Meanwhile, Amanda reached out to a journalist she knew at a major business magazine. The journalist, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Lisa, was immediately interested. If what you're saying is true, this could be a huge story, she said during our first meeting. But you'll need to be absolutely certain. CEOs don't go down easily. We have the proof, I said, sliding the USB drive across the table. Lisa spent the next 2 days reviewing the files. When she finally called us back, her excitement was palpable. This is bigger than I thought, she said. Brad's fraud is bad enough, but Callahan? He's been siphoning money from the company for years. This is corporate corruption at the highest level. The article dropped on a Monday morning. The headline was brutal. Fraud, greed, and corruption, inside the scandal at company name. Within hours, the story had gone viral. The article detailed everything: Brad's embezzlement, Callahan's cover-ups, and the toxic culture they'd created. It even included anonymous quotes from employees describing the bullying and exploitation they'd endured under Brad's leadership. The fallout was immediate. By noon, the company's stock had plummeted, and employees were gathering in clusters around the office, whispering and staring at their phones. Callahan was nowhere to be seen, and Brad had locked himself in his office. Then, around 3 p.m., an email went out from the board of directors. Subject: Leadership changes effective immediately. Dear employees. Effective today, Mr. Callahan and Mr. Dawson have been removed from their positions within the company. We are committed to rebuilding trust and transparency, and we will be launching a full internal investigation. Thank you for your patience during this difficult time. The office erupted into cheers. I could barely believe it. I had done it. We had done it. But the surprises weren't over. 2 weeks later, I was called into a meeting with the board of directors. I expected it to be a formality, maybe a thank you for exposing the scandal. But when I walked in, they greeted me with smiles and handshakes. We've been reviewing your role in this company, one of the board members said. Your leadership during the recent crisis has been nothing short of extraordinary. We believe you have the vision and integrity to help us rebuild. I blinked, stunned. Are you offering me a promotion? The board member smiled. Not just a promotion. We'd like you to step into the role of Chief Operating Officer. When I left the meeting, my head was spinning. I had gone from being overlooked and underestimated to being one of the most powerful people in the company. As I walked past Brad's now empty office, I couldn't help but smile. Justice wasn't just served. It was served with a promotion.